Well, good morning, good morning, good morning. This is Barry Jones with SP History. Today we are beginning episode 2 of the Miami Mole series, which is, if you look at the entire Miami material, episode 14 of all of the Miami episodes. And this is the climax of everything related to Miami. If you watched yesterday's episode, I began this part of the Miami Mole series talking about the 6 assassination plots against JFK and how each one had a saboteur who caused the assassination plot to fail and ultimately require the next assassination plot and the next and the next. And the majority of these had uh, a saboteur. We talked about Washington, D.C., and I told the story of Richard K. Snagel, the double agent, who forced the second plot uh, after Washington was canceled. And the second plot was in Chicago. And I told the story of the FBI informant named Lee, who, along with a landlady, helped sabotage the November 2 plot. White House got word of it, canceled the trip, which necessitated plots 3 and 4, which both happened in Miami on November 18th. For the president's scheduled trip to Miami that morning, we did not get into the Miami particulars. I just briefly outlined the nature of the plot and talked about how they didn't go through, but I saved that discussion for today because that is the one that it's the only time that there were 2 plots in one city, especially on the same day. And it's the only one for years and years and years I could not locate, could not come up with through all the research that I did, the name of someone who sabotaged either one of those plots or names of people who sabotaged both of them. I just came up empty year after year after year. The plot number 5 was in Tampa, which was that same day in the afternoon. And of course, we talked about Santos Trafficante calling off that plot. And then ultimately, we get to Dallas on the 22nd of November, 4 days later, and that plot succeeded. But we did include a discussion of an attempt to sabotage the plot by, again, Lee Harvey Oswald, this time by going to the FBI office with a letter that was sealed in an envelope. And that letter was subsequently destroyed by the FBI, and all evidence that connected him to James Hosty, such as the name and number in his address book, was altered. And in a written transcript, that this address book was given to the Warren Commission minus James Hosty's name and number. And this was an attempt by the FBI, first, to destroy evidence, the letter, and second, to alter evidence, the notation in the address book, which pretty clearly shows that Oswald was trying to warn the FBI, like he did in Chicago. The assassination plot was full go in Dallas for about 2 weeks later. You wouldn't destroy a letter if it, like they said, contained a bomb threat. That would buttress the narrative that Lee Harvey Oswald was a lone nut who killed the president. You wouldn't destroy that evidence. What evidence you would destroy is if the assassination happened despite a warning 2 weeks earlier from Lee Harvey Oswald that this was exactly what was going to happen. So I think it's pretty clear they destroyed the evidence that would incriminate them, and they manufactured evidence that would incriminate Oswald. So though he tried to be the hero and sabotage the plot again, like he had in Chicago, later in Dallas, he failed. And he failed because the FBI intended him to fail. So today, the subject is the Miami plots. And I teased it, told you the name of the guy whom I believe is the saboteur of these 2 plots. And this is a name that was not familiar to me maybe 2 weeks ago. I got a phone call. I don't normally answer phone calls. Uh, from unfamiliar numbers, but I did in this particular case, and I'm glad I did. It was the grandson of Grant Stockdale. And he was calling, he'd watched a couple of my Miami episodes, and Grant Stockdale is from Miami, so that piqued his interest. And he was asking me what I knew about Grant Stockdale, and I had heard the name. You can't help hear a lot of names that on their face seem unrelated to the JFK assassination, but because they're in the JFK orbit, you see their names while you're researching other things, and you just kind of gloss over them. And for years, I think that's what I had done with Grant Stockdale. Never really researched him in particular, and that was an oversight. So I'm thankful for Grant Stockdale's grandson to bring that to my attention. And as we were talking about it, and he was filling me in, and he's done years of research himself, but he's also a family member, so he knows a lot of information from the inside. As we're discussing it, and I'm putting pieces together in my mind, I'm already thinking about all the Miami stuff because those are the episodes I was in the middle of researching and producing. And a gigantic puzzle piece fell into place. Now, this is before I did any research, but it's based on all the other years of research that I've done that have led to questions about Miami. And the question I've always had about the Miami plots was who alerted the White House to change all the logistics of their trip to Miami in the hours, not days, not weeks, but in the hours before they came to Miami? Who alerted the White House to what was fixing to happen? Somebody on the inside had inside information that alerted the White House. Who was it? It didn't go through the normal channels. It didn't go through an FBI informant who alerted the Secret Service. It didn't go through the local police. There wasn't a document chain where this information made it back to Washington. And so as a result, the trip was modified or canceled, whatever. No, in the hours before the trip to Miami, everything changed. And that just doesn't happen when you're talking about presidential trips anywhere. There's a lot of coordination with a lot of different agencies and moving parts, and there's always a document trail, and there's people who have knowledge of what's going on. It's just like in a vacuum, everything changed. I mean, like in the hours right before they came, and the Miami plots didn't succeed as a result of that. And I've always wondered who it was. I knew who sabotaged the Washington, D.C. plot. His name was Richard Case Nagel. I knew who sabotaged the Chicago plot. His name was FBI informant named Lee, probably Lee Harvey Oswald, most definitely Lee Harvey Oswald. I knew it was the landlady. I knew who sabotaged the Tampa plot. It was Santos Trafficante, called it off. I knew who tried to sabotage the Dallas plot. It was Lee Harvey Oswald again. Who was JFK's man on the inside in Miami? And so, this is how this research goes. You learn new things, which cause new questions to pop up into your head. And so as you try to research and discover the answer to those questions, you learn more new information, which might answer the old questions, but they always cause new questions. And you just kind of lurch along over the years, over the time, from question to question, from question to question, searching for these answers. And I'm thankful for that phone call a couple of weeks ago. We've had several subsequent conversations. And in the meantime, I've been doing a lot of research on this individual, and it has helped answer that particular question for me anyway. I can't prove it 100%, but I believe that Grant Stockdale was JFK's man on the inside that helped save his life, or at least delay the inevitable by a few days. Saved his life, certainly, in Miami. So I'm going to attempt to move my face here. There we go. Get into this. All right. So a little background. He's a Southern boy, born in Mississippi, and went to the University of Miami, 1915. Went and got a business administration degree, and that will be you can kind of see business and his proclivity for making money and involving himself in business seems to be his main interest. It's the thread that kind of runs through his entire life. He gets involved first in Miami real estate and becomes the president of the Miami Junior Chamber of Commerce. So he's pretty quickly becoming a mover and shaker in the Miami business community. Pearl Harbor happens, and Stockdale, like hundreds of thousands of other young men throughout the country, enlisted. In his particular case, he enlisted in the Marine Corps, served in the Pacific, and fought in the Marshall Islands and Okinawa. So he's a war hero. So then he comes back after the war, back to Miami, South Florida. And here, for the first time, you start to see him dabbling in politics as he helps a friend of his, a Democrat, which in the 60s, if you're a politician in the South, you're a Democrat. Republicans, they called it the Solid South. It was a Democratic stronghold, Democrat Party stronghold, the South was. And so George Smathers is his friend. I've got him pictured here. Stockdale is the young man pictured on the left with the red circle around his face. And George Smathers, pictured on the right, is his young Democrat Party friend who sort of introduces him to the arena of politics. So in 1946, which is about a year after the war ends, after Smathers wins, he becomes Smathers' administrative assistant. So this is going to be a relationship that I think impacts Stockdale in such a profound way. It opens doors for Stockdale going forward. It also, I think, ultimately leads to his demise. But because if you are an assistant in the Smathers political machine, if you want to call it a machine, then you're going to take on whatever interests Smathers has. That's going to be your cause as well. And it's going to introduce you to that milieu of people that are also in that same cause. And that's going to be really relevant to our discussion of Miami and these conspiracies coming out of Miami. So what is the cause? Smathers, coming from South Miami, South Florida, is going to be like most of the other politicians from this part of the world. He is going to become obsessed with Cuba. He's an elected politician from Miami, which is overrun with these Cuban exiles, which is overrun with CIA officials, which is overrun with organized crime figures, all trying to get rid of Castro. So it's not a surprise that a politician from that same area would be obsessed with Cuba and Castro as well. He, in 60, after JFK becomes president, Smathers supported JFK's Alliance for Progress, which was a government program, sort of like a Marshall Plan almost, not to rebuild after a war, but to spend a lot of American dollars in Latin America specifically to prevent the expansion of communism. You know, what's happened in Cuba is water over the dam. But what we don't want is expansion of communism into other Latin American countries. And so basically playing the role of sugar daddy, Santa Claus, trying to negate any necessity for these poor Latin American countries to turn to the Soviet Union. Smathers was one of the first public figures to warn about Fidel Castro and the dangers that he posed. In a New York Times article, he said, quote, "We have a moral as well as a legal responsibility to pursue a policy that will lead to Castro's downfall. So he's pretty vocally and firmly staking his uh, reputation and his political career on the side of the anti-Castroites. That's Smathers' position. And of course, Miami is an ideal location to be in anything related to the anti-Castro activities because that seems to be the leading industry in Miami during this period of time. As I mentioned, it's overrun with Cuban exiles, organized crime figures, and CIA figures. And they're all down there engaged in the same endeavor. They have different motives and different uh, goals, but the larger goal is the same. They all have the same enemy. His name is Fidel Castro. So this is sort of Smathers' identity. This is his. It's like any politician. I remember, when my first exposure to politics, and probably the first time I was even interested in it was when in 1980, when Ronald Reagan was running for president, and he had some pet issues that you know the thing that I remember about Ronald Reagan, because I would hear my mom and dad discussing it at the dinner table. If I read the newspaper back then, and that's how you got your news from the newspaper, it was always about cutting taxes and the Reagan tax cuts. And that's kind of, he had a lot of other interests. He was anti-communist, he was this, he was that. He had a lot of other things that he would campaign on. But what I remember, the single issue that seemed most important in my household around our dinner table was cutting taxes. And so politicians get these reputations. What is their main thing? What is the if they got in an elevator and had 15 seconds to give you an elevator pitch about why you should vote for them, what is the one thing they would talk about? And with Ronald Reagan, it was always cutting taxes. Well, with George Smathers, it was about getting rid of Castro. And so in Miami, surrounded by Cuban exiles, organized crime figures, and CIA figures, all with the same goal, he's going to be a very useful individual to their cause, obviously. And as assistant, the administrative assistant for George Smathers, Grant Stockdale, is going to be immersed in this cause as well. And my guess is an administrative assistant is going to be with George Smathers every time he's mixing and mingling with these people. He's meeting with these people. Here's my administrative assistant. They're going to get used to seeing him just like they're used to seeing Smathers. And this is going to be a very important detail going forward. 2 years later, Stockdale jumps into the political ring himself, and he is elected to the Florida State House of Representatives, where he didn't serve a long time. He was only there until 1949. In 1949, Smathers introduces Stockdale to a young congressman from Massachusetts named JFK. So in 49, you think, well, that's 11 years before JFK runs for president. So this was JFK's first foray into politics as well. And here you got these young politicians meeting and making the introductions and becoming friends and supporters. And they're all of the same age. Stockdale served in the Pacific during World War II. JFK served in World War II, also in the Pacific. So they got some things in common. And they sort of start a friendship, which is, I've included this picture, a couple pictures here. This is a little older picture where Stockdale and Kennedy are meeting over dinner, it looks like. This is after JFK's been elected president, so this is years later. But one of the gifts that Stockdale gave to the President of the United States, John F. Kennedy, was this watch. And there's correspondence where JFK writes back thanking him for this watch, calls it the Stockdale watch, and he wears it. on special occasions. So they become friends. And of course, the meeting was arranged by Smathers, but the relationship kind of takes a life of its own apart from Smathers from that point on. In 52, Stockdale becomes a member of the Dade County Commission, where he serves until 56. And then in 59, he becomes the director of the Florida State Committee to elect John F. Kennedy. So John F. Kennedy, this is about 10 years into their relationship, and Kennedy has decided to run for president. And these are plum positions, but they're only given out to people you really trust. And of course, JFK was not the political juggernaut we think of him today. In 59, he was one of many running for president on the Democrat side, and he was not considered the favorite. Okay. It's difficult sometimes to look back now and understand the context of the time. But if you choose to support John F. Kennedy for president in 1959, for nomination for president for the Democrat Party, you are essentially taking the side of the underdog. You know, you've got some pretty big Democrat names, including the LBJ, running for president, who have much more political sway in the South than this Northeast liberal John F. Kennedy has. And so this is indicative, A, of their friendship, but B, of some political courage that a man like Grant Stockdale has to attach himself and become involved in the JFK campaign for president during the Democrat primary, when he is essentially backing a horse that most people don't think has a chance of winning. So obviously JFK is going to remember that. That is, most politicians are so self-serving, and they look around, they put their finger in a wind, they say, who's going to win? And I'm going to attach myself to that person because I'll get a good job in the administration after he wins, and then I can spin that off into a big political career for myself, or opportunity for myself. It's not often that a young up and coming politician chooses the underdog and says, I'm with you. And so he campaigns with JFK in West Virginia. I did a series on the West Virginia primary and how that was a pivotal primary for JFK in the Democrat primary, to solidifying his role at transitioning from the underdog to the favorite. West Virginia was key. And of course, that was the campaign in West Virginia that was pretty much bought and paid for by the Chicago mob. So if you're campaigning with JFK and for JFK in West Virginia, you are essentially working with the Chicago mob and the big unions to help put him over the top. So, you know, I'm trying to introduce to you as we go all these occasions for Grant Stockdale to meet people and interact with people and mingle with people and become part of this milieu supporting around JFK. That's going to end up being a double-edged sword in his life. It's going to be, on one hand, become useful because he knows these people from Miami and all these anti-Castro people through this relationship he had with Smathers. But now, because of his relationship with the Chicago mob and all these big unions that are supporting JFK in West Virginia, and his campaign his presence there helping with the campaign, he's going to be able to circulate, mingle with these people as well. And he campaigns in Oregon and New York, and he ends up serving as a member of the DNC's National Finance Committee. So he's just rising through the ranks, kind of like JFK is rising through the ranks. Anyway, as a reward, and this was controversial, JFK took some heat for this. In the campaign, he criticized political patronage, giving jobs to people in the government just because they supported you during the campaign or gave you money, whatever. And he turns around in 61 and appoints Stockdale to be an ambassador to Ireland. And Stockdale was only 45 years old at this time. And he really as far as an international uh, diplomat, didn't have any experience in that arena at all. He'd been on the Florida State House of Representatives only for a year. He'd become a member of the Dade County Commission. He was a state representative and a county commissioner. And then he helped and became director of the Florida State Committee to elect JFK, helped him campaign, and rose to the DNC ranks. But he had never served like as in the U.S. Senate or the U.S. Congress, where he made any international trips and engaged in any international diplomacy, anything of that nature. His claim to fame was he was a friend and a supporter of JFK. So JFK seemingly violated his own position against political patronage by appointing Stockdale to, and this is a plum position. The Kennedys are from Ireland. Uh, Very famously, the Kennedys take a trip to Ireland. All kinds of pictures of them motorcading through Dublin. And this was a very personally significant and significant country or place to the Kennedy family, and obviously a symbolically important position to the Kennedy family. So this indicates a close relationship between Kennedy and Stockdale. Even after JFK died, a contingent of bagpipers from Ireland made the trip across the Atlantic and came to participate in the funeral at the request of Jackie. That's how important Ireland was, the nation of Ireland was, to the Kennedys. They're Irish Catholics from Ireland. So to be the young man chosen to be the ambassador to Ireland, that without saying so much, so in so many words, that indicates the relationship where it stood between JFK and James Stockdale, or Grant Stockdale, in 1961. All right, so let's talk about some of Stockdale's business enterprises. During this political rise, he, in addition to being a political partner with George Smathers, he becomes a business partner with him and another man named Eugene Hancock. And that is a very important name, Eugene Hancock. Smathers is important as well. And I think I've hammered that point because he introduced Stockdale to the anti-Castro activities in Miami and all the people there. Eugene Hancock is important for a different reason. And it was the company called the Automatic Vending Services Incorporated. And they sought out government contracts to put vending machines in government buildings. In 61, about the same time that Stockdale was appointed by Kennedy to go over to Ireland, the Pan Am Tobacco Corporation sued Stockdale and his company for $131,000. They wanted access to these government contracts that Stockdale was getting, and their allegation was, according to the New York Times, that he had used undue political influence to gain contracts for Automatic Vending Services Incorporated, and it gave him an unfair advantage. And so they sued him. Pan Am claimed in its lawsuit that he had used his personal and political connections to secure for his company, specifically a vending service contract at Aerodex Incorporated, which is an aircraft engine maintenance company in Miami. And this is a U.S. government contract, and it was a big one. And they felt frozen out. And, this is technically, you could, this is difficult to prove. Okay. But the fact that he had these political relationships and that he was in partnership with Smathers, and together the two of them were friends with JFK, they get these big contracts. It didn't look right. And so they sued him. Obviously, when you get into a lawsuit, you go through a phase called discovery, and you get to go through all their books, which is the danger of these civil lawsuits. You might not know what you're looking for, but you might, in the process, find a lot of other hanky-panky that helps prove your case. So they're going through these records, and they uncover that automatic vending services had contracts totaling $500,000 a year at Patrick Air Force Base and the Air Force Missile Test Center at Cape Kennedy. So what they're discovering is this $131,000 contract that they're suing over was peanuts compared to some of the other contracts that Automatic Vending Service Incorporated had. And so this is all being reported in the news. And eventually, though, because these things are difficult to prove, unless you have a smoking gun document or someone who from the inside turns over, spills the beans, turns over state's evidence, whatever. These things are difficult to prove. The lawsuit eventually gets dismissed, and on appeal, the dismissal is upheld. So Stockdale, in the eyes of the law, is absolved of any wrongdoing in this lawsuit involving Automatic Vending Services Incorporated. But that whether that it didn't accomplish the goal, the lawsuit, the goal that Pan Am Tobacco Corporation had. They didn't get any money out of it. They didn't get any contracts. Nothing tangible came of it. However, if you are a political opponent of JFK, and you see this in politics all the time, if they can't get at the king, they go at all the people around the king, and they try to muddy them up, smear them with these allegations of financial impropriety or criminal activities. And it's not about proving it. It's about smearing them and getting that out into the public ether, so to speak, so that people think he's crooked. The court twice said that Grant Stockdale was not liable for any civil liability with respect to the Pan Am Tobacco Corporation. And when looking at all the allegations of corruption, 2 different juries said he was not guilty. But there is a stink of corruption now on Stockdale, which is not helpful if you're Kennedy. And in 61, when all this is happening, 61, 62, he is running into all kinds of resistance internally within the government in Washington there, as he tries to stand up to some entrenched interests that have a lot of power. And we've talked about his war with the CIA. We've talked about how he grew to distrust the Joint Chiefs at the Pentagon. We talked about the Bay of Pigs, and in 62, it's the Cuban Missile Crisis. And he's being increasingly viewed as weak against communism. He's coming under attack after Bay of Pigs for allegedly calling off the air support and pulling the chicken switch. And in other words, he is, like most presidents, he's making enemies. And they're searching for anything they can use against him. And if that means they have to go after somebody in his orbit, so be it. So I think Stockdale, if he was not the ambassador to Ireland during this period of time, but was still a Miami businessman running his Automatic Vending Services Incorporated down there, none of these lawsuits happened to him. You become a target when you rise through the ranks, and now he's a trusted advisor or a trusted friend in JFK inner circle. And so to get at JFK, people go at the people around JFK. So I think it's really important to clarify that and establish on the record that as far as the legal proceedings against Stockdale were concerned, he was free and clear. But when you're in the political arena, it's not just about the technical aspects. It's about what people think and people's impressions, things of that nature. So because of that, he now has this stink on him of corruption. And so newspapers, reporters start digging. This is the danger. Once they sense any vulnerability at all, even though he was proven innocent, acquitted in both of those trials, uh, they smell a rat. So as he is serving as ambassador, here you see a picture of him as he is observing the troops there in Ireland, here in his official capacity as ambassador. Newspapers began reporting on another Stockdale business relationship, and this time with a guy named Sidney Kessler, and they managed to find a $5,000 interest-free loan from Kessler to Stockdale, which means basically the money was given to him and he could pay back the principal, never had to pay back any interest, but they called it a loan. Technically, it's not a loan. Anyway, so it looked like some more of this corruption. And so they reported on it. And it happened to be at a time when Stockdale was investing in constructing an $8 million apartment complex down Miami. Now, it's pennies, right? $8 million overall project. And they are reporting on a $5,000 loan. It's pennies. But because this is coming on the heels of the lawsuit involving Pan Am Tobacco, JFK gets involved in this one. JFK didn't get involved in the first one, but this is the second one. Actually, it's the third because he had two trials in the original lawsuit. And so JFK tells him to just pay the money back, and hopefully this will go away. So Stockdale was ordered by his boss to pay the money back, just to evade or get out from underneath any stink of scandal. In 62, this is when things took a turn for Stockdale because he is caught up in something bigger than him, and it's the investigation into Bobby Baker and his Servview Corporation, which was also a vending machine corporation, and it was operating out of Texas. And this was LBJ's bagman in the Senate. You want to read about Bobby Baker and stuff that he was involved with, and the scams that they were running, and the bribes that they were getting in exchange for government contracts. Read that book, Wheeling and Dealing. And of course, this is Bobby Baker in his own words, how he essentially was sort of the Hunter Biden of the Biden family, and all the wheeling and dealing that the Biden family has been doing over the last 30 years. Bobby Baker was the Hunter Biden of the LBJ criminal enterprise. And all of it is starting to percolate to the surface. Of course, this is JFK's vice president. This is another guy, another prominent figure in the JFK orbit that is being tainted with scandal. And you understand all of this started in an effort to get at JFK. And so when you partner yourself with somebody who's very powerful, you just got to kind of understand this is why they do vetting processes when they pick their VPs and whoever they're going to put in ambassador positions, whatever. They vet them, hoping to find people that are squeaky clean, and none of this can ever be used against them. Well, LBJ was anything but squeaky clean. It didn't take very long to investigate LBJ's past, understand that. Baker's company was providing these vending machines for companies working on federally granted programs, meaning he was kind of like Stockdale, who was getting these big government contracts, put the vending machines in. This is what Baker's company was doing. But it turns out, as they are investigating Baker, they find that Baker's machines were manufactured by a company that were owned by Sam Giancana, a Chicago mafioso, and other mobsters based in Chicago. So this establishes a firm connection between Bobby Baker and his Servview Corporation and the Chicago mob. The president of the Servview Corporation who ran it for Bobby Baker was Eugene Hancock. I told you, remember that name. This is the same Eugene Hancock that was Stockdale's business partner, along with George Smathers, in the automatic vending services company. So Eugene Hancock is simultaneously involved in Grant Stockdale's automatic vending services corporation and in Bobby Baker's Servview Corporation. Of course, his connection to the Servview Corporation goes all the way up to Chicago and the mob. So it became evident that Hancock was operating as Stockdale's frontman in two separate business partnerships, that he was being used as a liaison, similar to how Bobby Baker was being used by LBJ. Eugene Hancock was Grant Stockdale's Bobby Baker. And these connections are not happenstance. They're not incidental, coincidental, or accidental. A guy like Eugene Hancock has a level of expertise and he has connections. And that's why you place him in these kinds of positions to help your company expand and grow, to bring in those connections, to bring in those assets, et cetera, et cetera. So this puts Stockdale back in the crosshairs again and his company because of the investigation simultaneously into, ironically, another vending machine company run by Bobby Baker. So when he's confronted about his involvement with Bobby Baker and the Servview Corporation, Stockdale made a mistake and he denied having any role in Baker's company. You know, maybe personally he didn't have any role, but his partner in the automatic vending services corporation did have a role in Baker's company. So it appears that he's trying to hide that, or he's trying to deceive the public. If he just came out and said, I don't personally, but I can see where you might think I do because Eugene Hancock works for me or with me, but he also works with Bobby. So I guess by extension, I do have a connection to Baker's company through Eugene Hancock. But he denied it. He said, quote, he was absolutely not a stockholder in Servview Corporation. Also, and this is a 62, he was confronted about his holdings in Automatic Vending Services Incorporated, and Stockdale claimed that he had disposed of all his holdings more than a year earlier when he became ambassador. These are easily verifiable claims that he's denying. And when they went and they investigated both of these claims, neither one turned out to be true. Stockdale did have a connection to Baker's company, it's Eugene Hancock, and he still had his holdings in Automatic Vending Services Corporation simultaneous to his tenure as ambassador in Ireland. So now he has, lied about it, and he's been caught in a lie. And so that's why JFK asked him to resign or forced him to resign as ambassador to Ireland in July of 62. So he really didn't serve that long, 61 to 62. And he was replaced by Matthew McCloskey at that point. So Stockdale is, at this point, out of the political game, at least externally. He returns to Miami. He becomes consultant to another vending machine company called Automatic Canteen Company of America. And that's an ad right there on that image. It's Automatic Canteen ad. And this company had contracts at Cape Canaveral, and which is a monster contract. So he's making money. He's out of the political game, at least temporarily, and he's back in Miami making money, doing what he does best. The political thing was short-lived, and really the most success that Grant Stockdale to this point in his life has had in politics has been supporting JFK. He was a state senator for just a year, a representative for just a year. He was in the Dade County Commission for 4 years, I think. But most of his political bones have been made in his relationship with JFK, either supporting him as the state campaign chair or the DNC Finance Committee or as ambassador to Ireland. That's where most of his political success has happened. Meanwhile, back to the Bobby Baker fallout. This is a picture of Bobby Baker during a time when, this guy was very prominent in the Senate. He was not a senator. He was, as I said, I think his position was he was like the secretary in LBJ's office. Everybody knew. And LBJ was very powerful senator at this time, and all these big companies that wanted government contracts, especially the big military contractors out of Texas, Brown and Root, the company that made the fighter plane, the F-111 fighter plane, General Dynamics, companies like that. They wanted these huge contracts with the government. They knew that they had to get LBJ on board, and the way to LBJ was through Bobby Baker. And in some of my other research, in my series on LBJ, I talk about paper bags full of cash money being delivered to Bobby Baker on its way to LBJ's office. Even during the time he was vice president, it was political corruption in this country didn't start with Joe Biden. It reaches far back. So anyway, the investigation of Baker uncovered links to Big Texas Oil, like Clint Murchison. We've talked about Clint Murchison. It was his estate down in Texas where the S-Force was trained. Mafia bosses, like whoever, all the mafia bosses in Dallas and Houston, Austin, places of that nature. And of course, Vice President LBJ, who ran the state of Texas, along with his buddy John Connally. In one particular exchange, there was a $100,000 cash payoff in exchange for a $7 billion contract from General Dynamics. This was one of those paper bags full of cash that was delivered to Bobby Baker for LBJ's vote to get that $7 billion contract to construct the F-111 fighter plane for General Dynamics. Of course, this company is based in Texas, and this is how the game's played. This is how LBJ became a multimillionaire several times over. On October 7th, 1963, this is 1 month, this is about 5 or 6 weeks before the assassination, Baker had to resign his post as secretary to the majority in the Senate, which, LBJ is vice president by this time, but he kept that position. LBJ made sure he kept that position so that he could keep his thumb on the screws of the Senate while he was acting as vice president. Fred Korth, the Navy secretary, also had to resign because it was discovered that he was involved in awarding this TFX contract in exchange for bribes to him as well. So the Bobby Baker scandal is exploding about the time JFK is assassinated. By the way, that is not a coincidental timing issue. LBJ and the timing of JFK's assassination, no one benefited more than LBJ did because he was about to be indicted. All of this, in fact, on the day of the JFK assassination, that morning, there was a hearing in the Senate from one of these people that was testifying to corruption, bribes that LBJ had taken while he was in the Senate, and even up to and including time when he was vice president. They were testifying right there in the Senate. They all got closed down after the assassination because LBJ becomes the president and these investigations go away. But in October of 63, these investigations are just ramping up, and it's creating a casualty list. So Baker has to resign. Fred Korth has to resign. The next target, and Bobby Kennedy was the one behind all this to create a pretext, a reason to dump LBJ from the ticket. They were going to use political corruption. He had already informed his members of the press that he leaked to regularly that it was okay to go after LBJ now. And boy, LBJ was in the crosshairs. He was the next target. But fate intervenes, if you want to look at it that way, generously. And JFK is assassinated before any investigation into LBJ can be completed. And of course, at that point, all the investigations stopped and tied off. So now it's pretty well understood, even though it didn't end up where everybody goes to jail and all that. It was pretty well understood, at least in Washington, that Bobby Baker was crooked, which means everybody in business with Bobby Baker is probably also crooked. And that is going to have damaging ramifications for people like Grant Stockdale. Remember now, he's gone through the legal process himself twice, and he's come out on the other side clean. But what's lingered over him is the stink of corruption because of those two lawsuits and the appearance of political favoritism or connections that are getting him these financial contracts, just the appearance of evil. And then the connection to the loan, the $5,000 loan that he got, the interest-free loan that JFK said he had to pay back, and then his connection to Baker, which he lied about twice. And so these connections Stockdale has are what's going to get him in trouble. First of all, we've established he's got a connection to Smathers, which connects him to the anti-Castro cabal in Miami. I mean, George Smathers was thick as thieves with these people, and Stockdale was his administrative assistant. So by extension, he was thick as thieves with the anti-Castro cabal in Miami. Now, that hasn't reared its ugly head yet, but it will. He's also got a connection with Eugene Hancock. And Eugene Hancock, as his partner in the automatic vending services company, and as Bobby Baker's one of Bobby Baker's partners, connects Stockdale to anything Bobby Baker's involved in. And of course, Eugene Hancock's connection, which is why he's useful in these positions, is his connection to organized crime, which is, out of Chicago. They're making all the machines for Bobby Baker's company. There's no evidence that they were making the vending machines for Stockdale's company. But again, there doesn't have to be any evidence. It's the appearance of impropriety. And then that third connection is to Bobby Baker. And there ain't anybody in Washington more corrupt than Bobby Baker and his boss, LBJ. Everybody in LBJ's corrupt orbit, the number one guy is Bobby Baker. And Stockdale evidently knew that this was not a connection that he wanted publicized or revealed, so he lied about it twice. So it makes Stockdale look like he's hiding something. So if you just consider, in my research, I've come up with what I believe are the 5 conspirators, each having separate motives to want to get rid of JFK. If you just use my list of 5 conspirators, Stockdale has connections to 4 of them. I'm going to show you. He's connected to Smathers, which connects him to the anti-Castro Cubans. The anti-Castro cabal includes the Cubans, the CIA, and the mob. So there's 3 of them. And then his connection to Bobby Baker connects him to LBJ, which is the 4th one. The only one he's not connected to is the Secret Service. So this puts a man like Grant Stockdale right smack in the heart of, whether he's a conspirator himself or not, which I don't believe he is, it puts him right smack dab in the middle of that cabal of conspirators, which puts him in a unique position to know things, to observe things, because he's trusted by these people. He can move in and amongst them. He can circulate, infiltrate. He can be in their meetings. He can uh, greet them on the city street. He's going to have his ear to the ground and hear things because he's circulating with these people. Uh, William Torbett, and this is not his real name. His real name was David Copeland, wrote in 1970 The Nomenclature of an Assassination Cabal. And this guy was from Texas, so he's down there in the heart of it all. He was a prosecuting attorney, and he admitted in his book that some of his clients included people who had committed political murder. So he's uniquely, like Stockdale, he's uniquely positioned to know things. And he claimed that he also represented people involved in the quote financial dealings of organized crime in Texas, which is all in those days coming out of LBJ's office. And boy, I don't have time to go into all of that today. If you want to know how that all worked, how LBJ used lawyers to protect his role in all of these money-making scams coming out of Texas. He was smart. He used lawyers because of attorney-client privilege. Um, just go to my conspirator series where I break them down into the 5 conspirators, and one of those is LBJ, and I talk all about it. I go into pretty exhaustive detail. But anyway, back to David Copeland. He says about Grant Stockdale, who gets mentioned in his book, quote, Grant Stockdale, ex-U.S. ambassador to Ireland, former George Smathers administrative assistant, and a stockholder and officer in Bobby Baker's vending machine and Florida land transactions, knew and was closely associated with almost all of the top figures in the assassination cabal. So David Copeland agrees with me, or I agree with him. I don't know if he has the same 5 conspirators that I have, but we're essentially saying the same thing. We're not saying Grant Stockdale was involved in anything. And to the contrary, he's going to try to save JFK's life. But he was involved with the people who were in this assassination cabal, which is why JFK is going to send him back to Florida with a specific purpose, because JFK knows who Grant Stockdale knows, and that information that he can provide the White House is going to be extremely useful. All right. This is where JFK engages in a pretty common practice by the Kennedys. If you've done any research on the Kennedys, you know that they're very good at finding or leveraging people to their own purposes. If you think back to the political campaign in '60 when Kennedy was running for president, Daddy Joe's relationship with the Chicago crime family proved to be useful in leveraging the Chicago mafiosos, and later it included all the mafia, organized crime figures across the country, into supporting JFK for president. And of course, because organized crime was controlling Teamsters Union during that period of time, it also engaged the support of the unions. The Kennedys were masters of leverage. And so Stockdale, returning to the story as he's being written about by these newspaper reporters, and information is being dug up, and he's getting caught in lies. So JFK has to force him to resign. He essentially fires him. And this once promising political career is now in shambles. And so we talk about how he returned to Miami. got back into vending machine business and started making money. But Kennedy wasn't through with him. And here's where Kennedy leverages Stockdale because he because he can, and he needs what Stockdale can provide. I guess this is politics, right? And so what happens next is, and I've included some source material in here so you know where I'm getting this information. Seymour Hersh, this is one of the very first books I ever read about Kennedy's, about JFK. It's called The Dark Side of Camelot. In November of 63, so this is the month JFK is assassinated. Okay, so we're getting right down to the nub of it. JFK, this is according to Seymour Hersh, this is the first example of leverage that is documented. JFK asked, and I use the word asked, but quotation marks, because basically told Stockdale, I need $50,000 for my personal use. And Stockdale even admitted to friends that the money he was raising for JFK was, even though he was the one raising it, it wasn't for him, it was for JFK. It had something to do with the Bobby Baker case. In other words, JFK is leveraging what he knows about the political corruption of Bobby Baker and how damaging that could be to his friend, Grant Stockdale, if it ever came out, to say, and you didn't even have to say it. He just said, I need $50,000 for my personal use. In other words, go raise me a personal slush fund, and you have to do this, or I will spill what I know about the Bobby Baker case, and or that could get out. That's usually how they present it. I'm not going to threaten you with this. I'm just going to say, listen, this could get out, and you don't want this to get out, but it could get out if you don't do for me what I'm asking you to do. I need $50,000. Stockdale wasn't happy about it, and that's why he told his friends. He was real clear about it. He was not raising the money for himself. He was not getting back into politics. He wasn't raising the money for a political campaign. He was raising the money for JFK, and he was forced to do it because of the Bobby Baker situation. So it put him in a vulnerable position. JFK is basically using incriminating Stockdale/Baker information or connections that he had access to, no doubt, from his brother Bobby, who was the Attorney General investigating Bobby Baker, to make Stockdale do this, to force his hand. So JFK is leveraging his friend. That's the first example of political leverage that the Kennedy White House is going to use against their friend Stockdale. The second case of political leverage, looking for my cursor here. I don't know why my cursor disappears. There it is. And involves spying. Now remember, Stockdale is from Miami. And he went to school there. He was involved in the business community there. He was a politician there. That's where he's from. And he is he's very immersed in the anti-Castro community down in Miami due to his relationship with George Smathers. And this is where Kennedy needs some information. And he knows that nobody knows Miami and all these anti-Castroites better than his friend Grant Stockdale. I keep calling him James Stockdale. And this is information according to Grant's daughter, Anne, said that JFK asked her father to carry out a spying mission in Miami. Now, I believe this was in relation to Operation Mongoose and the fact that at this late date, if you remember, JFK has ordered these 5 bases in the Miami area to be shut down. He has told the Operation Mongoose operators to cease and desist, and they are defying him. You remember the Everglades base and the liaison from the CIA, E. Howard Hunt, continued to launch raids against Cuba. The no-name key base, the CIA liaison, Frank Sturgis, was continuing to launch raids. And Bobby, who was in charge of all the Operation Mongoose operations, got wind of it and realized the CIA and all these anti-Castroite forces down in Miami were defying presidential order decree and doing their own thing. They're launching their own war against Cuba, even though we're technically not at war with Cuba. And of course, the objective was to try to get us in a war. And so as we proceed through 63, and we've got this standoff going on between the White House and what's going on in Miami, it's difficult for Bobby and the Kennedy brothers to get accurate information about what's going on down in Miami. So this leverage to create or to make Grant Stockdale spy for the White House is because the White House needs up to the minute information, accurate information from somebody who knows the scene, from somebody who won't be bullshitted by people, who will know who to talk to, who to watch, et cetera, et cetera. I saw an article where he was actually watching as they loaded bombs and stuff onto planes. And he's reporting all this stuff back to the Kennedy White House, probably to Bobby Kennedy specifically. I put a photo here of Anne at the top. She's the one circled. This is when she's just a little girl. The bottom photo, she was age 17 by the time they were going to Ireland for her father to be the ambassador. But she was not pictured in that bottom photo because she was wearing slacks and she didn't feel like she was with them, but she declined to be pictured with them in this particular photo. But that was her as a little girl. And then by the time they went to Ireland, 61, 62, she was 17, 18. So Anne would be in a position to know she's a young adult by this point in time. And she says that Stockdale, her daddy, was asked by JFK to go to Miami, or as he is in Miami, to spy for the White House. And I believe, though she wasn't specific, I believe this has to do with Operation Mongoose, or the tail end of Operation Mongoose. It's supposed to be shut down by this point. They're trying to get information. The White House wants accurate information about what's going on in Miami, and they need somebody on the ground down there that can tell them the straight skinny, right? The whole truth. So these are two examples where Kennedy leverages a politically damaged supporter of his, a friend of his, into doing something that will benefit him. A, raise a personal slush fund of 50 grand for me. Do this so that, and I don't know what reasoning Kennedy gave him, but no doubt goes back because he said so himself, had something to do with Bobby Baker. He said that himself. So evidently it was made clear to him that if he didn't raise this money, information might be leaked, connecting him or revealing the connections between him and Bobby Baker, and he might go down with the ship. Bobby Baker had been forced to resign. Fred Korth had just been forced to resign. He might get caught up in this Bobby Baker scandal. Instead of just resigning from the ambassador of Ireland, it could get worse. It could always get worse. So he's leveraging that. And of course, I'm sure Bobby's right smack in the middle of it. And then the other one is forcing him to act as a spy for the White House in Miami. All right, so now we're at the plot. This is November. We're coming up on November 18th, 1963, when Kennedy is scheduled to go to Miami. And I've detailed this plot in other places, but these pictures here on the right This is a FBI informant on the right. His name is Joseph Miltier. He's an interesting character. And on the left is a guy named William Somerset, who is he's actually the FBI informant. And in that position, he uses sources like Miltier to get information. So Somerset is the actual informant. So on a memo dated November 15th, 3 days prior to the visit, a Miami detective, S.J. Hebert, said that he had received a phone call on the 15th from a Secret Service agent named Jameson. And Jameson asked to speak with William Somerset because Somerset had some information that might be pertinent to this trip they're taking to Miami on the 18th. And the information that Somerset had, and this is documented in several places, was that in a conversation with one of his sources, Joseph Miltier, who was a member of the White Citizens Council in Georgia, you can kind of look at him and you get that sense this guy's kind of on that side of things. Anyway, according to the FBI informant Somerset, this conversation he had with Miltier took place a couple weeks earlier, November 5th, and Miltier had told him that Kennedy was, quote, a marked man. And when Somerset pressed him about it, how is he a marked man? Miltier had told him he's going to be killed from an office building with a high-powered rifle. And he's talking about his trip to Miami. And of course, Somerset is an FBI informant, so he had reported this up the chain, which is why on the 15th, the Secret Service calls asking to speak with Somerset directly to get clarification on this. You know, they're fixing to come to Miami in 3 days. Interestingly, and I've lost my cursor again. There it is. Now that was the first plot. The second, so that involves a motorcade, right? Any motorcade that goes by a tall office building, according to Miltier, this is how he's going to be taken out. The second plot happened on the 16th. So this is the next day. So the 15th, the Secret Service calls the FBI, want to speak to your informant. The next day, a group identifying itself as the, quote, Cuban Commandos mailed a threat to assassinate to JFK in Miami. This threat was mailed to the chief of police in Miami. And in the threat, they said, quote, the Cuban Commandos have bombs ready for killing JFK and Mayor King High, either at the airport or at the convention hall. The airport, because that's where Air Force One would land, and the convention hall, because that's where JFK was going to speak. And so we have these two plots on November 18th, and neither one of these threats was ever shared later by the Secret Service, the FBI, or the Miami police with the White House or the Warren Commission. If you remember on November 2, the informant named Lee and the landlady talked about a plot in Chicago. That information was forwarded through the FBI to the Secret Service to the White House. And if you remember, the White House canceled the trip. So here we are 16 days later, and this time they don't share it with the White House so as to prevent them from canceling the trip. I think that says a lot right there. They wanted this trip to happen and this plot to succeed. So they did not share this information with the White House. Okay. In fact, they didn't share any plots with the White House after what happened in Chicago because they were afraid they'd cancel these trips. And yet, in the hours before JFK comes to Miami, the White House gets word of these plots, and completely change all of the logistics involved in the trip. They don't cancel the trip. Miami is too important. I've talked about it before. They have to campaign in Florida. They have to campaign in Texas. Those are the two southern states they got to have to win the 64 election. you, you can't cancel these trips and never campaign there. You'll lose. You got to go. And so they can't cancel the trip, but they can change the logistics around threats that they are getting tips about. For example, the motorcade was eliminated. What was the first threat that Joseph Miltier said? In his motorcade, as he passes a high office building, he's going to be shot with a high-powered rifle. So they canceled the motorcade. They changed the airport landing to a baseball field. You can see I've got the picture here. Instead of flying in on an airplane, landing at the airport, they fly in on the helicopter and land on second base. And instead of giving a speech at the convention hall, another alternate location is. They are specifically changing the logistics of the trip based on the tip of the threat. The threat was a motorcade. He's going to get killed by a motor during his motorcade. So we won't motorcade. The threat was we have bombs at the airport. So we won't land at the airport. The threat was we have bombs at the convention hall. So we won't speak at the convention hall. The threat was the longer he stays in Miami, surrounded by all these conspirators that we've established over all these different episodes, the greater likelihood he's going to be killed. So he flies in, he flies out. He's only there a couple hours. In other words, the fact that the White House changed these specific logistics relative to these specific threats tells me, and has always indicated, that there was somebody on the inside spying for JFK. And even though the ones that you would think would share this information with the White House, the Secret Service, the FBI, or the Miami Police, none of them, they went out of their way not to share it with the White House. So if they didn't get it from this information from the Secret Service, the FBI, or the Miami Police, where'd they get the information? It's the spy. And I believe that Stockdale, while he was in Miami spying on the Operation Mongoose anti-Castro activities, because of the plots to kill Kennedy came from the same sources, got wind of the plot, picked up the phone, had a direct line of communication either to Bobby or Jack, and told them, hey, when you come to Miami, this is what's going to happen. And the White House, realizing that these plots have not been shared with them by the people that are supposed to share, they realize that they're surrounded by snakes. And instead of sharing all the logistical changes with them, they just make all the logistical changes themselves at the last minute. And Stockdale's information and his position as a spy for JFK there in Miami saved JFK's life in Miami and foreclosed on those two plots. So going back to what I started saying at the beginning of today, I knew Richard Case Nagel sabotaged the Washington plot. I knew an informant named Lee and a landlady in Chicago sabotaged the Chicago plot. Now I know that Grant Stockdale sabotaged the two Miami plots. And we know that Santos Trafficante sabotaged the Tampa plot. And we know that Lee Harvey Oswald tried to sabotage the Dallas plot. So that question that I've had for years, and as I'm hearing the grandson of Grant Stockdale talk about what his grandfather was doing in Miami, it occurred to me that this guy might be the answer to that question. But the story continues. 4 days later, Kennedy goes to Dallas, and of course we know what happens. It's assassinated. 4 days after that, the 26th, Grant Stockdale flies to D.C., and this is unscheduled, and he meets with Bobby and Teddy. Now, this is after the funeral and all that hubbub. And afterwards, he's just disconsolate. He's depressed. He can't be consoled. He tells his friends, quote, the world is closing in. He tells his attorney on November 1st, William Freites, said Cody started talking. It didn't make any sense. He said something about those guys trying to get him. Then he kept talking about the assassination. According to an article written by Miami Herald reporter John McDermott, Stockdale had gone to Washington and given information to Bobby and Teddy about the Dallas assassination. But instead of being received well, and instead of them thanking him for this information, this inside information that he had, they brushed him off. In fact, Teddy Kennedy called Grant Stockdale's wife and said, "I'm worried about your husband." His exact words, he expressed, quote, anxiety over Stockdale's mental state. And they're starting to paint a picture about Stockdale like he's depressed and he's losing his mind. He's not right. The question is, and this has been bandied about by people who wondered what he went and told Bobby and Teddy on the 26th. Was it Stockdale's, quote, spying mission in Miami, using his Bobby Baker connections, because he had Bobby Baker connections. He admitted it himself. And of course, Bobby Baker connections gives him connections to LBJ and gives him connections to all these Texas oil people who are deeply involved in the assassination. Is that all of that information and his proximity to these conspirators that provided Stockdale with information that he shared with Bobby and Teddy about who killed their brother in Dallas? They didn't believe him, and it was too late to save his life. But something forced him. He'd saved his life in Miami and probably thought, okay, we're past that crisis. Didn't realize that we're going to try again so soon, 4 days later in Texas. His Miami connections through the anti-Castro connections that he had because of George Smathers helped him sabotage the Miami plot. But he had other connections too, which became useful later after the assassination in Texas, because Bobby Baker and LBJ, he has these Texas connections as well. And no doubt, after the fact, found out through these connections just what happened. And because he's one of them, he's going to hear about it. He's going to know. He's going to have inside information. And this is his friend. Jack Kennedy was killed. So he goes to Washington and does what the friend does. He wants to help with the investigation and help the family members have closure and have some sort of justice. But they don't receive the information the way he thinks that they would receive. Normal people would be happy to have any kind of information that would help steer the investigation in the right direction. But at this point, Bobby and Teddy, they don't want to know the truth. Now, this was always a question for JFK research for a long time. Why would Bobby not be interested in knowing the truth about what happened to his brother in Dallas? And I think the answer to that is because Bobby already knew who killed his brother in Dallas. Bobby knew within the first few minutes after he was told. He knew immediately. Look at the first 3 actions that Bobby took. He called the CIA director. He called his friend down in Miami, Enrique Harry Ruiz Williams, who is his spy in the anti-Castro community. And he sent his private investigator to Chicago and onward to New Orleans and Dallas to investigate the mob. In other words, Bobby had the same 3 suspects I've had when I was talking about Miami. He suspected the mob. He suspected the Cubans, and he suspected the CIA. In fact, according to a witness who was in the room when Enrique Harry Ruiz Williams got that phone call from Bobby, Bobby told him flat out on the phone, one of our guys did it. That's a key word there, that pronoun our. One of our guys did it. Who was in charge of Operation Mongoose after the Bay of Pigs? It was Bobby Kennedy. Who was involved in Operation Mongoose? It was the Cubans, it was the CIA, it was the mob. Bobby was over all that. And what he said to Harry was on the phone, one of our guys did it. One of our guys that we were training to go after Castro instead killed my brother. So when Grant Stockdale comes to Washington on the 26th to tell him what he knew about the assassination in Dallas, based on his inside information and his connections to Bobby Baker and all the LBJ people, he was telling him information that Bobby already knew. And of course, included in that information was probably his suspicions about LBJ, who is now the new president of the United States. And as Attorney General, that means LBJ is his boss. And so Bobby either made one of two calculations. A, I don't want to know because it incriminates me. Or B, I don't want to know because there ain't nothing I can do about it. I tend to believe B. He knew the power that he had when his brother was president was now gone. Carlos Marcello knew it. Jimmy Hoffa knew it. They always said, if you cut off the tail of the dog will continue to be a problem. If you cut off the head, the dog ceases to be a problem. They just cut off the head. Bobby lost all his power. And the reason I believe it was B is because when he ran for president in 68, right before he himself was killed, he indicated in an interview that one of the first priorities of his administration, should he win the presidency, was to reopen the investigation into his brother's death. In other words, he was biding his time to when he became president again, so he could get his hands back on the levers of power and conduct an honest investigation and get to the bottom of it. But between 63 and 68, he had to bide his time. And he said all the right things supporting the Warren Commission, the Warren Report. But secretly, he was waiting for the moment when he could conduct the investigation the right way. And of course, no one knew more about investigating these players than he did. I mean, he helped with the commissions when his brother was a senator. As Attorney General, he went after the mob. He ran Operation Mongoose, which turns out to involve three of the conspirators that killed his brother. He knew all these people. And in the minutes after the assassination, he had already identified three of the suspects, but he kept it to himself. And when Grant comes to him, I think his calculation was, there's nothing I can do about it right now. And so he brushed off Stockdale. So what happens next? Stockdale goes back to Miami, and this is where he had his office. And on December 2nd, 1963, 10 days after JFK died, Stockdale fell from his office on the 13th story of this DuPont building and died. All kinds of suspicion about that. Nobody believes in the JFK research community today. I don't know anybody who believes that he jumped and committed suicide. When he showed up that morning, the regular secretary who worked with him for all these years was not there. She or he, whichever, was at the dentist appointment. And there was somebody else new filling in. His office was locked. This person was helping him get keys to unlock the office. She said, I believe it was a she said that he was in good spirits. He wasn't depressed in any way. She didn't observe any anger or hostility or depression or hopelessness or any of that. But the death was immediately ruled a suicide. You know, it's interesting to me. I did a few episodes where I touched on the CIA program called MK Ultra, and one of the original participants in that CIA program was a scientist named Frank Olson. And when he started to have a crisis of conscience about MK Ultra and all the uh, goings on related to that evil program, uh, he went to some of his bosses, some of his superiors, expressing some of his reservations. Next thing you know, he took a header out of a skyscraper in New Orleans or New York, and he died from a fall. And there's some documents that came out during the church hearings that show that one of the most effective ways to kill somebody, make it look like either make it look like suicide, was to push somebody out of a building. This is a CIA document. Push somebody out of a building that's at least 75 feet tall. I think it was 75. And so just like they had means but to kill people through cancer drugs or heart attack guns, to make it look like they died of natural causes, falling from high places was another one of their tactics that came out during the 70s. Of course, that doesn't help Stockdale's cause. Immediately, Smathers goes public and says, I think my friend was depressed. Stockdale's wife goes along with that. She was, according to Ann, in June 2004, Ann Stockdale claimed that her mother only supported Smathers' statements because she feared for the lives of her children. So, it was one of those open and shut cases. He killed himself. Of course, in the context of all these other suspicious deaths, Stockdale's death raises all kinds of alarms. According to Ann, President Kennedy asked Daddy to go to the Air Force Base south of Miami. This is Ann talking about the spying mission, to see if bombs were being loaded on the planes. This is the Operation Mongoose story I told you. They had, by this point in time, ordered these bases to be closed down, all their operations to cease and desist. So anything that was still operating out of these bases in and around Miami were happening against the president's orders. And she said, quote, bombs were being loaded on the planes. She said, I believe one of the reasons Daddy was killed is because he knew that the government was being run by the military complex. The military complex didn't want the American people to realize, and still don't, that they're calling the shots. Daddy knew he was being followed, which is why he got distraught afterwards, told his lawyer, told friends, it's all coming into an end. People are following me around. He told Mom that they were going to get him, and they did. There was an attempt on my life several days after Daddy's funeral. She says, I now realize that this was a scare tactic to silence my mom. If you speak about anything, your kids are dead. And it worked. Unbelievable. So, this spying mission, I think what Ann says here is corroboration, or supports my belief that he was sent down there to help Kennedy shut down Operation Mongoose. He needed information. And while I was there, he got information about a Miami plot, actually 2 Miami plots, and he forwarded that on to the White House, and they waited till the last minute to change all the logistics of that Miami trip. And then 4 days later, found out that there was another plot in Texas, and before he could stop it, it happened. 4 days later, he went to Washington to tell Bobby and Teddy what he knew about the Dallas plot, and they brushed him off. But the fact that he shared that information with them, no doubt, alerted people in the conspiracy cabal that there's a loose end out there. I have a few questions I told you, the new information always leads to new questions. So question number 1, did Stockdale obtain information about the assassination of JFK via his business contacts with Bobby Baker? If so, that implicates LBJ because Bobby Baker didn't do anything apart from the direction and or orders from LBJ. Question number 2, did Stockdale obtain information about the assassination of JFK via his partner, George Smathers, a key figure in the anti-Castro community in Miami? And if so, that implicates the Cuban exiles, organized crime, and the CIA, because that's who made up the anti-Castro community in Miami. Which leads to question number 3, did JFK spy in Miami, whom we now know as Stockdale, pass on this information to the White House, saving JFK's life on November 18th? And that leads to question number 4. After Dallas happened, did Stockdale pass on this information to Bobby and Teddy, thinking they would appreciate it and act on it? And, you talk about a guy perfectly situated to know, as I said, and as David Copeland said in his book, you're talking about a guy that was connected to or ran in the circles of 4 of the 5 conspirators. Again, anti-Castro Cubans, organized crime, CIA, and LBJ through Bobby Baker. It's 4 of the 5 conspirators. So where does that leave us? We now know that at the time Stockdale met with the Kennedy brothers, Bobby didn't want a full investigation into the assassination. I explained that. But there was no guarantee that Stockdale would not pass his story on to others who might want a full investigation. In other words, he had to die. He was a loose end. Not only was he a loose end because he couldn't be trusted to keep his mouth shut, but there were others who were watching and who knew that he knew things. So he needed to be dealt with as a warning to anybody else who might be tempted to go public with what they knew. And of course, this is buttressed by the quote from Anne explaining why Stockdale's wife went along with Smathers' quote, suicide by depression claim. Her husband had already been killed, and according to Anne, she herself was the victim of an attempt to kill her. No doubt Mom was paying attention to all that. Another conclusion, a reason why Stockdale had to go or had to die is because Stockdale's connections to 4 of the 5 JFK assassination conspirators and Bobby Baker meant that he had knowledge of the crime perpetrated against the former president and the myriad of crimes perpetrated by his successor, LBJ. So I don't know yet if he was killed by the conspiracy to kill JFK or if he was killed by LBJ afterwards to cover up his role in the assassination and also what Grant Stockdale knew about Bobby Baker, which could be used against LBJ. I just think there's a variety of reasons why Grant Stockdale was a loose end to more than one entity. He was a loose end to the conspiracy cabal to kill JFK, but he was also he was a loose end to LBJ's own personal corruption racket with Bobby Baker. And he'd already shown a willingness to talk. And so he had to be dealt with. So look at these saboteurs that we've discussed in these various assassination plots. Something they have in common. Richard Case Nagel, we talked about how he died suspiciously the day after he received a letter from the Assassination Review Board asking him to come testify and turn over documents. The day after he received that letter. Lee Harvey Oswald was assassinated 2 days after he was arrested for allegedly killing the president and a Dallas police officer before he could go to trial. He had already explained or claimed his innocence, claiming he was a patsy, and to shut him up, he was killed. No trial. And another saboteur was Grant Stockdale, who suspiciously died 10 days after JFK's death. The only one who didn't die from our list of saboteurs was Santos Trafficante, who was on the inside of the plot. His people carrying it out. And he was, uh, so he was one of the conspirators. He lived to be a ripe old age, 72, died of stomach cancer. But all these other saboteurs were taken out. So that's the story of Grant Stockdale and his role in sabotaging the plot, plural, in Miami, and his understanding, I believe, of what happened in Dallas and his efforts to reveal that to Bobby and Teddy, I believe got him killed. And this is why I started off today saying the relationship that he had with George Smathers was sort of like a double-edged sword. It helped introduce him to a lot of people that later became very useful to the JFK White House. This is why they ordered him to spy, but then eventually got him killed. So that concludes my episodes, my 2 series on Miami. The first 12 episodes were on the town itself and all the movers and shakers there, conspiracy that came out of Miami. And the second little mini series, 2 episodes, is about the assassination plots and the mole in Miami who saved his life twice, Grant Stockdale. I hope you enjoyed that series. And until next time, I hope everybody has a blessed day. Thank you.